Okay, thank you, Francesco Yanane.
Iannone.
Yanone. Yes, I will get it the third time correct. All right. So excellent. What's interesting was that he fooled us into thinking that neuroscience is the correct thing, you stupid, to borrow Bill Clinton. And finally, he came to the fact that there's science and axonometry involved. And that's an interesting way of putting it together because those were the last two in his first observation, right? So it's interesting that how heritage can be brought out with the latest technology. Now we move on to Richard Kearns. Richard is an independent artist whose work encompasses photographic, printed, and digital media, right? And he has worked on several projects calling on his seasoned experience as a documentary photographer, recording transitional societies. In 2009, Richard moved from professional photography practice to teaching photography, enabling time for a master's in printmaking. That opened a route back to his original vocation of a practicing artist. So he has worked in many projects and collaborations over the years. And today he's going to be talking about the Orang Laut, a visual record. Richard.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this conference. It's been very interesting so far. As you can see from my biography, I have a fair amount of experience in photography, and particularly in heritage photography, which covers artifacts and peoples as well. But I want to focus more on what I've done photographing communities. And I'm going to start with a little bit of my own personal history, which began photographing in an area of London, which went through a great regeneration over the period of the last 15 years ago. And this is Arnold Circus. Arnold Circus is possibly the first social housing that was produced in the world. It was built to an extremely high standard, and it was built on top of a very infamous estate called the Nickel Estate. And the Nickel Estate was the home to such stories of Jack the Ripper, body snatching that went on for the Whitechapel Hospital. And with all the old rubble for the Nickel Estate, a large mound was built in the centre of the new development, and a traffic island was built, on top of which was a bandstand, which over the 100 years or so of its existence went into disrepair. Recently, or not so recently, 10 years ago, the area began to become gentrified, became very trendy, moving from a poor working class district to a new middle class district. And as a result, a great deal of interest was put by the residents, the new middle-class residents, coming in regenerating the bandstand and the area in general. And they brought in festivals, traditional bandstand bands, brass bands, modern folk bands, but they also brought in shared skills from the community, and everyone was being involved, and this enlivened the whole area. There's a large Bangladeshi community there as well, and they brought with them Karom, and they had championships, and everyone was encouraged to take part in this. So really, I'm still focusing on the intangible skills and tangible elements of a community, and with this, the regeneration was done through the consumers of it. So the consumers were also the initiators of this whole project. And here we have some of the children of the original inhabitants of the housing estate from when it was first opened in 1900s. There's an old people's home very close to the centre, and they're included too. I continued photographing Arnold Circus up until a week before coming to Singapore 2.5 years ago, at which point it had been fully restored. And interestingly, the community that started the renovation resisted attempts from local government to take over at the point at which it had become a success. Now, I want to put into context a little bit the dialogue that I, as a documentary photographer, have with my own sort of visual history. And it seems to me that heritage began really in the 1600s, or one of the sources, with the cabinets of curiosities. And I feel that in some ways that didn't really change for hundreds of years. We have the early developments in photography at the end of the 19th century by Francis Frith, and you still have this, the cultural appropriation. So here Francis Frith is photographing himself dressed up in ethnic costume, bringing a culture from what was then fairly far away to the middle-class audience of his homeland. He was a very religious man and spent a long time in what was then Palestine and Egypt, photographing topographical landscapes, and brought, as a result, the beginnings of a postcard company that became one of the world's biggest suppliers of topographical images and postcards in the world, not folding until the 1970s. At the time of Frith, there were many photographers going out photographing tribes under threat, peoples under threat, marginalized communities, but very much within a context of a European language, such as this. So here we've got the identification of the Arab woman who's sitting here from side and front, but posed very much in the language of a 19th century portrait painting from Europe. So it doesn't really tell us an awful lot about her life or the life of her people. And this, I feel, is still present today. This is an image taken recently for a book that was published by Jimmy Nelson of disappearing communities around the world. And this particular person is from the Hulu tribe in Papua New Guinea. Now, the photograph, along with the others, are wonderful technical portraits, but they don't tell us an awful lot about the person who is appearing in the image. And when in fact this, taken quite some time before, is probably closer to the truth. And this sort of highlights really the link between photography as a language and tourism and the desire to make a good photograph that people will want to hang on their wall or turn into a calendar. So this brings me on to the project that I was working on recently when I was invited to photograph the members of the descendants of an Orang Laut community for the Island Foundation, which is a Singapore-based charity that looks after the interests of some of the marginalized communities in Indonesia. I wasn't embedded in this society for very long, so I had a very sort of pressurized timescale in which to photograph them. And under such situation, as a photographer and as somebody who has my origins in art, I am very interested also in making pictures that people actually want to look at. So this image here is an image from a fishing trip that I was about to go on. I was going out on their boats, but I arrived at 4:30 in the morning waiting for the declaration that it was time to go out on the sea. So as the light was rising, I started taking photographs. And so, as a photographer, I'm also visioning how people are going to respond to the images that I take, and I'm also talking back to the history that has gone before me, because I can't separate myself from that cultural language. And in terms of heritage documentation, I have sort of issues in how that really is captured, whether through artifacts or through people. So here we've got the fishermen just about to leave the quayside to go on their fishing trips, and for each case, for each family that goes out, and it's men, women, and the son, 2 to 3 per boat, the families come out to wave them off every morning. They're off to their daily job, 6:30 in this case. And in terms of intangibilities, this is a kind of scenario that I find very hard to capture and very hard to pass on to an audience in the form of a photograph in itself. Now, the Orang Laut are an interesting community. By the age of 8, a boy is expected to be able to fully handle a boat by himself, and is considered slightly odd if that's not the case. So life exists on the sea and on the land. And traditionally, of course, they were only on land for 3 months of the year during monsoon, and the rest of the time they were in the water on their boats. And there are still communities of Orang Laut that still live primarily at sea. Although being nomadic, they're quite hard to track down. So this boy here is just emptying the boat of water, which has filled up, and he's doing this by just swishing it from side to side in a balancing act that I certainly could not achieve. So life goes on the boats and the water, and during the day there's a lot of time spent on repairs and just generally passing the time and smoking lots and lots of cigarettes. I was really struck by the fact that every single person from the age of about 16 upwards, and it didn't stop, every single person smoked rapidly, which was quite a shock. So in terms of intangible skills and heritage, I'm interested in which skills are preserved and why and how are they found. And one of the examples that I was able to be involved with was this. As I was walking, doing the night shots, because I was also shooting through the night, documenting their social lives and their activities in very low light conditions, because although they had mains electricity put in a year ago, it frequently cut out. So a lot of the time we're in pitch black. Generators are not particularly reliable. So this image was a fire, a controlled fire that was on a boat, about 5 boats out to sea. And I thought, oh, what's that? That looks very interesting. So I spoke to my interpreters and people I was with and stumbled across the 5 boats with my camera, which was surprisingly difficult. So it sort of highlights another kind of element of intangibilities, this physical way in which people move about the world in which they exist and interact. The fire on the boat was actually caused by a small furnace which was built in the boat, and the guys that were operating it were smelting tin to modify fishing hooks for their fishing trip the following day. And when I came back, the whole process was explained to me. There are 2 pieces of bamboo that are glued together with rice starch and then wrapped in a cotton bandage to hold it together, and a safety pin's put through the top to supply a hole for the fishing line to be threaded through. The tin there is actually what's poured in the previous slide. It wouldn't be there; it'd be an empty hole. So the modified hooks would then be strung to one long line, about a foot apart. So there would be a number of them, and they would be fished by hand, no rods involved, and they would be pulling up fish at an incredible rate of knots. The skills for that, and as I mentioned before, it would literally be mum, dad, and son on a boat, and everyone is fishing. Everyone's involved in this lifestyle. But unfortunately, as the modern world has encroached on this community, they don't really have the skills to operate in a market economy. So they are in very great debt to their suppliers, who charge rather high interests for the equipment that they use, and often don't actually get to keep the fish that they catch. Much of what they do is used from the environment around them. This guy's actually preparing crab nets, so the raw materials which he's cutting down and fashioning into nets, which is then dropped into the sea. The only bought material in this case is chicken wire, which obviously is easier to manufacture than nets. So during the day, because fishing's quite a hard career, people are involved in general maintenance and construction and preparation for their nightly fish. And interestingly, when I was first there, this guy had been bitten by a shark whilst he was pulling up one of the fishing nets. So if anyone's planning a holiday to Bintan, I would avoid the windsurfing if I were you. So luckily in his case, the Island Foundation, who I was working for, were there and were able to take him to a hospital to have his hand reconstructed, which had worked fairly well. So I saw him a few weeks later. So intangible skills. I mean, this young woman is opening up a restaurant, and she is preparing a hearty meal of what I believe to be condensed milk and white bread for her clients by torchlight. And it's this adaptability is kind of uncapturable, I think, by many modes. And how do we actually preserve this kind of skill within a community, this kind of relationship that people have with the things around them and the objects that they're using? Here we have a man who is sifting the bottom of his boats for shrimp. I'm not sure quite how the shrimp got there. There were some little communication skills, but this is one of the jobs he was doing at night. And again, I was attracted to this image because I was trying to make a good photograph, an interesting photograph. The youth of the community, like youth everywhere, tends to hang around the latest piece of technology. And although there are plenty of smartphones, and particularly karaoke machines that seem to be in all of the houses, the motorcycle is the main form of the new campfire, let's say. But there are issues here. I mean, I saw people take apart these engines, pick out an oil filter, and the filter would go straight into the sea, which is quite a shocking way to sort of live. And I guess that's down to education. And I think this again is a good example of the sort of intangible skill transfer. I mean, these guys have been brought up on boats. They've been brought up in an environment of boats, and a motorcycle engine is not a million miles away from reconstructing a boat engine. So this is a kind of form of training for them as well. So again, you know, documenting is you're never far away from the medium that you're using, and you're constantly referring to images that you've seen and are trying to make images that are interesting and that you're pleased with, or that play with compositional elements in particular ways, and it can easily cloud the issue of what's going on within a community, where instances like this can be easily missed. Now, this is a fairly young boy, and he's carrying what must be about 50 kilos of water across his shoulders. And he would do this at least once a day in 2 recycled buckets. All sorts of buckets they use, paint buckets, whatever they can get their hands of. And out of the 4 wells that actually exist in this village, only one of them supplies drinkable water. So there are lots of hardships to this sort of heritage of which has an extremely long history in this region. It goes on for thousands of years. And in intangibilities, I kind of keep coming back to the fact that what exactly is it, and what exactly is it that people are trying to preserve, and how do you capture the daily life, the daily routines, and the interpersonal skills of a society's actions. And here, life was just bustling along the quayside as the day went by, and the young woman in red just walked across, kissed the baby, walked past, and carried on her way. And I thought that, well, that was actually a sort of beautiful moment that could happen actually anywhere in the world. It could have happened. And of course, children play with kites and all sorts of things everywhere in the world as well. Now, these images were produced for the Island Foundation, and they went into an exhibition which actually finishes today at the National Museum, and it had several sponsors, and the sponsors had a fairly large presence in the exhibition as well. This is a shot from the exhibition. And I think this sort of raises issues as well between public, private sponsorships and partnerships as to who is the heritage for at the end of the day. Who owns it? Who's going to be manipulating it? Why is there an interest in that heritage? What are the outcomes? So in some ways, depending on how you read the sponsorship and how that presence is there, it can easily change the context of a project without the proper curatorial control. Now, I'm going to carry on, just finish off with one last little model that I observed recently in Australia, where people are beginning to take control of their own heritage. And this particular one is at the Wardan Aboriginal Centre in Western Australia. And this is run on a voluntary basis with no government sponsorship or help. The land was donated to them by a German businessman who bought it and gave it to them. And here you have an Aboriginal woman who was raised in a traditional way, bringing tourists around like they do in many scenarios, and showing the significance of in this case a rubbish dump and what it means to the people and how they interact with it. And you have a group of tourists who are interestingly standing around and taking notes and photographs, like I was. And in this case, she's showing a particular leaf that's used as soap for cleanliness, rubbed together and create a froth. Because obviously, if you are in the middle of the outback and you get sick, you are in a pretty dire situation. So obviously, cleanliness and antibiotic plants, etc., are of paramount importance to your own survival and that of your family. Now, I think that in this kind of scenario, in this sort of documentary, I think that it's quite important to actually include the elements of the tourism that surround it, because it kind of is what it is. There's no mystery. It's not necessarily a calendar picture, but we have to understand that these are elements of a society's heritage that are being passed on to people that are interested but may not remember it a week later. And that is the scenario that many heritage consumers have, I feel, with the heritage that they are visiting or consuming. I mean, interestingly enough, the offers from European medical companies to patent their products have been resisted because they believe that their heritage does not belong to them; it belongs to their children, which is an interesting take. And I think that's one of the intangible beliefs that the current global model of economic growth and profitability doesn't really get on with very well. And this is an interesting example of a very prehistoric tree that bleeds this sap to protect itself. I mean, this tree grows about 1 inch every 10 years. And it's a grass tree. And with this, they mix it with kangaroo shit, charcoal, and the ground down gum from that tree, treat it with heat, and they make a very powerful epoxy-like resin which lasts for generations. So if a member of the community were to make, in this case, this is a spear-throwing aid, it would be passed down to their next generation and perhaps the next one until a new one was needed. So there is within that community a strong sense of heritage, which is being passed on to those that wish to visit. And interestingly enough, they do also offer the traditional meals and the opportunity to watch a dance, which accompanies many kind of tourist villages. Now, this is a snake trap, and this is the last photograph that I'm going to show. And I think, and I've included this because it sort of symbolizes some of the issues that I feel that I've identified in this whole scenario of documenting heritage. What happens here is the snake crawls under the rock in the morning. Usually the mum, in this particular case, a matriarchal society, so she'll come along with her big stick, shove it in there. If there's a snake at the end, it gets clobbered and thrown in the cooking pot. And in a way, I think it represents the sort of the whole heritage consumerism and its allegiance with tourism that I think illustrates particular dangers in preserving it and capturing it. Now, I think to finish, I would like to just leave a few provocations, really, that I think within the whole heritage sector are quite important. And thinking as someone who's been involved in it, what's recently been bugging me as a photographer is who actually benefits from heritage. Is it the people who it belonged to or did belong to? Or is it the consumer? Who is it that actually benefits from all of this stuff? Another one that I think is quite interesting is, when does heritage actually become a concern? When is it? At what point is heritage to be preserved? Is it at a point, for example, when it no longer poses a threat to the prevailing political ideology of the time? And lastly, is photography a valid medium? For me personally, I feel that photography is not really a way of documenting heritage, for the reasons that are really illustrated with the whole cabinet of curiosity. if you stick a stuffed bird in a museum and go and look at it, it's not actually going to make you an ornithologist. All you're going to look at is a stuffed bird. And I think in many ways that can be the problem for the vast consumers of heritage who are probably not educated in what they're looking at, but they're making the audience, they're making the footfall, they're making the funds for the museums to exist. So those are. I mean, there is one other that I sort of toy with, the whole which is linked to these, which is the whole question of morality and ethics, and I think that in many ways it's very much ethics, and particularly morality is very much a point of view as well. So one last word is that I'm not actually anti-heritage. I very much enjoy consuming it as much as many others do, and but I do have some of these problematic issues that do sort of plague my interaction with it. Thank you.